merely a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Kybalion is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hello and welcome to episode 95 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. As regular listeners of this podcast will know very well, in the last 3 years, I've found in all my interest with what happens to our consciousness after we die, and also my incredible interest in all things spiritual, as well as my interest in things extraterrestrial or ultra-dimensional, or whatever you want to call it, I found that it's all converged in the last, I suppose, at least a year and a bit. It's probably not surprising. I am pretty convinced, although of course I do want to try and keep an open mind, that this convergence is by no means an accident, that there is no death. There is merely the transference from the consciousness of the human body back to where it came from. And then, of course, as I learned before, the ability of that consciousness then to decide what it wants to do next, whether it's to have another life or another form of entity development, or helping people who are not in their physical body, or any range of things, probably limitless things that one could do. That is obviously something that has come through so clearly. But what has also come through slightly later than that in the podcast was that everything that we perceive as being extraterrestrial, or interdimensional, or ultradimensional, whatever you want to call it, UAPs, UFOs, all of that is really nothing more than a manifestation of the phenomena of consciousness that is not in the human body. Now, of course, this is not a new idea. This idea that the entities that are visiting us have the ability, let's say, to either appear as something that's familiar or something that is perhaps not familiar. They also have the ability, I think, to be able to shift into something that potentially could ultimately look familiar or scare us. Now, I think that would answer, of course, a lot of the questions that have been asked about what are ghosts, what are demons, what are angels. We've had that discussion in the last couple of weeks. Now, as all this becomes more unified in my mind, and it's much more easy for me to be able to explain and understand quite what these manifestations are that people are witnessing, or seeing, or hearing, or most importantly, are emotionally feeling. What quite are they? It's easier for me to now understand that they are just manifestations of consciousness. Now, they could be manifestations of a person's individual consciousness, that he's somehow projecting outwards and it's producing something that is a real thought form, or it could be a manifestation of a lot of people's consciousness that's manifesting into a thought form. Also, it could be entities that are coming from other realities, other dimensions, that are projecting themselves into our dimension. In the last week, I've been, for some reason, particularly drawn to famous accounts of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. Now, this abduction scenario, it can be interpreted, obviously, if you're religious, as being some form of possession or evil intent, or if you're, a Christian, you could also perhaps say that you may have had some form of divine interaction. If you are coming from where I am coming from, and you believe that consciousness is something that exists outside of the human body and we're merely the sort of receivers of consciousness, you will understand that potentially these people who are describing abduction experiences are either literally being abducted into alien spacecraft, or they think they are because the consciousness is taking them over, and if you like, they're almost going into a dream where they're astrally projecting into other realities, other dimensions, and are not physically there, but for all intents and purposes, it's like a dream. They really do believe that they are going through that experience, and they are going through that experience, but not in a physical way. They're going through it in a conscious-based way. And one of the books led me to another little book called The Kybalion. Now, I had never heard of the Kybalion. Maybe my listeners have. But what makes the Kybalion relevant to this podcast, and any discussion about talking to the dead, is a broader conversation around alien disclosure. And when you read this book, Initiated by Matthew Roberts, you're not just reading a typical military UFO account. It begins with the well-known USS Theodore Roosevelt encounters that I've discussed before and led to the Tic Tac and the Go Fast videos that were released. These were objects that were seen and recorded, and it's also pretty much leaked that the information that is going to be released in the 41 videos in the next few weeks from the Department of Defense in the United States of America will include hitherto censored versions of this encounter, which are crystal clear, apparently, a very high definition, and maybe you'll even actually see the craft to the point of them being shiny and metallic. But that'll be coming, I think, in the next few weeks. That'll be very interesting. But this particular incident at the USS Theodore Roosevelt, people have described as being perhaps increasingly symbolic, psychological, and deeply personal, because if you were there and if you actually saw it, it's affected people in different ways. And this phenomenon, therefore, was interacting with Roberts's personality and his consciousness, not just his senses. And there's another book which I've read in the last week, and it's called The Incident at Devil's Den by Terry Lovelace. It's a very famous book. It's probably one of the best-selling books, next to Whitley Strieber's books on alien abduction. And on the surface, it's a classic abduction narrative of two men, missing time, a craft, and non-human entities. But what makes Lovelace's account stand out is physical evidence he later uncovers, like an anomalous object that was surgically removed from his leg. And you'll probably know that Whitley Strieber believes that he has an implant behind his ear still, and he won't have it removed. So these encounters are becoming more and more common. More and more people are coming forward and talking about them. And it's something that seems to be happening, these encounters, across more than one level of reality at once. Now, where this book, The Kybalion, becomes relevant is that it's a little book that talks about its 7 basic principles. Mentalism, correspondence, vibration, for instance, that suggests that reality is not a single fixed layer, but a spectrum of interrelated states. Now, what's going on with reality? Well, because of the places where these accounts happen, they seem to blur the line between physical and mental reality. And communication between these entities bypasses language completely. And the environments that people describe seem to be a mixture of both real and constructed, a little bit like those DMT realities that are described by people that are taking hallucinogenic drugs. So researchers in this field are looking at subjects such as extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, or even interdimensional as the answer to this. Now, the Kybalion brings everything together. It talks about what is called the Hermetic idea, that reality is fundamentally mental and multi-layered. And there is a growing realization, of course, that the phenomenon that is being witnessed may not be out there, but actually inside us, as I mentioned before. It may be operating through some hidden structures that shape our own perception, our own reality. So today, for the rest of the podcast, I thought I would do a deep dive into this mysterious, philosophical, and actually very influential book called the Kybalion. It feels like when you're reading it, and I have read it now because it's very short, and I've also listened to an audio version of it, which is quite interesting. It feels like when you're listening to it that it's sort of unlocking hidden layers of reality, because it suggests there are laws that are beneath thought itself. So let's begin simply by telling you about the background to the Kybalion. It was published in 1908 by some anonymous authors who decided to call themselves the Three Initiates. And they claim that they're summarizing the teachings of Hermetic philosophy, which is a tradition associated with a legendary figure called Hermes Trismegistus. Now, whether Hermes was a real person or a symbolic figure, or a blend indeed of myth and philosophy, and I've seen accounts that he might actually be Moses, or he could be Abraham. I don't know. But it doesn't really matter as much as his ideas, because Hermetic teachings revolve around the very bold claim that reality is not random. It follows laws, subtle, mental, universal laws. And if you understand them, you don't just observe life anymore. You begin to participate in life in a completely different way. At its heart, the Kybalion is built on these 7 principles. They're not so much as rules. They're more like mechanisms that seem to underlie reality as itself. And they operate a system beneath our existence. And they sort of describe a kind of physics of the mind and reality. The principles are a very great shift in our perspective. And it's expecting you to accept, perhaps, that reality is more mental than physical. It's not imaginary, it's not fake, but fundamentally it's shaped by our mind. Now, at first this sounds abstract and maybe even a bit mystical. But if you think about our everyday experience, everything that we know, every sound, every color, every emotion, every memory, it's happening in our awareness. And the idea of the external world really is something that your mind is constructing. So the question becomes, are we in reality, or is reality appearing in us? Think about that for a minute. I was drawn this week to a discussion that I saw about quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, without doubt, seems to be the science that people are believing could begin to explain everything that at the moment we think is psychic. For instance, if you have a photon of light and you project it at 2 particular slits, normally the slits go through the photon of light go through the slits simultaneously, and they converge and create, I believe, some form of interference pattern at the other side. But if you actually observe this with your own eyes, normally what seems to be happening in these experiments is that the photon of light chooses to go through one or the other of the two slits, and there is no convergence and there is no interference pattern. And scientists who are struggling, I think, to come up with an understanding of what quantum mechanics is and what happens at the quantum level, say that this is an example of the ability for our minds to affect physical outcomes. Now, if scientists are beginning to accept that, then the Kybalion seems to be almost like a handbook to this process that might actually help quantum mechanics and science research. So, step one, or principle one, is called mentalism. And it starts off as the all is mind, the universe is mental. Now, the idea is that it's saying that everything is in our personal mind. Now, it's not just claiming that you can, for instance, just think a car into existence. Instead, it's suggesting something deeper, that the foundation of reality itself is mental in nature. It's not physical matter as the ultimate base, but something more like consciousness, awareness, or intelligence. So if you think of a dream, when you dream, the world feels real, the objects seem solid, and the people seem independent. But all of this is happening within the mind. It's something that I feel every night because I have and always have had very vivid dreams, and the world that I'm inhabiting feels entirely real, and quite often there's a cast of characters that I don't know in my real world. But all of this, as I said, is happening in my mind. It's hard to describe if you have not had these types of dreams or lucid dreams. Now, the Kybalion doesn't say life is just a dream, but it uses the analogy to point towards something that, what if reality is more like a shared or structured dream, governed by laws, but still rooted in the mind? It isn't just an abstract philosophy, because if reality is mental in nature, then our thoughts are not trivial. All our thoughts are not trivial. You have to be very conscious of every thought you have, because it will be having some physical effect at some level. And perception isn't passive. Awareness isn't just observing, it's participating, and suddenly your inner world is not separate from reality, it's entangled with it. You'll feel that you're not just reacting to the world anymore. You'll feel that your perception is a fundamental part of reality. Now, there is a common misunderstanding, and it's important not to fall into a trap here. Mentalism is often misinterpreted as you can control everything with your thoughts, but that's not what the Kybalion teaches. It's much more nuanced. There are laws governing the mental universe, just like physical laws govern matter. And understanding those laws allows for an alignment. So it's not about forcing reality to obey you. It's about learning how reality already functions and working with it. So if the universe is mental, then the distinction between inner and outer might not be as solid as it seems, which raises a deeper question. Where do you end and reality begins? The second principle is called correspondence, and that's described as above, so below, as below, so above. Now, you may have heard this phrase before. It's certainly one of the lines that seems to appear quite often in philosophy and mysticism and even pop culture. But in the Kybalion, it's not just a poem. It's very structural. If you think about the structure of an atom, it resembles a solar system. Your thoughts influence your emotions, which influence your actions, which shape your life. The way you relate to yourself often mirrors how you relate to others. These aren't coincidences. They're called correspondences. And they're just reflections across a scale. And one of the most practical implications of this principle is that your inner state and your outer experience are not separate systems. They mirror each other. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently enough to matter. So instead of trying to change external circumstances, you might ask, what patterns exist internally that echo externally? What beliefs quietly shape how I interpret events? And what emotional habits keep repeating in different situations? Because if these patterns repeat, then understanding one level gives you insight into another. Correspondence is not about magical thinking. It's more like I understand the patterns at one level and I can recognize them at another. Principle number 3 is called vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. So nothing rests. At first glance, this might sound like physics, and in a way it is, because modern science tells us that matter isn't truly solid. I saw an incredibly interesting video the other day where a scientist showed, I think, probably one of the strongest electron microscopes that exists. It's a truly incredible thing, and it can actually, using particular science that I don't really understand, allow you to see things now at the atomic level for the first time. And you can see that the structures that exist at the atomic level are truly different. Now, I believe at that level, the atoms and everything are moving. Everything is vibrating. The energy is fluctuating and the fields are interacting. So the idea in the Kybalion, which extends this idea further, is suggesting that vibration is not just physical, but mental and emotional as well. So there are different sorts of vibration. There is dense and subtle vibration, there is very heavy and light vibration, and there is slow and fast vibration. And this applies not just to objects, but to your thoughts, your emotions, and your states of awareness. And if you think about different emotional states such as fear and anger and calm and joy, they all feel different, not just psychologically, but almost physically. They seem to have a different texture or frequency, and that's the principle that is being discussed in the book. That movement is constant. Nothing is ever truly static. Everything is a pattern. And this then, of course, includes our habits, our emotional loops, our thought patterns. Nothing is frozen. They're just repeating vibrations. If you, for instance, feel anxious, and if you try to jump straight to joy, it often doesn't work. But moving from, say, anxiety to curiosity maybe, then to calm, and then to clarity, that's a shift in vibration that feels kind of possible. There is obviously another misinterpretation about vibration that, of course, the New Age movement has created. They talk about raising your vibration. But that can become very dismissive and unrealistic because all vibration states exist for a reason. Lower or heavier states aren't wrong. They're all part of the full spectrum. The goal isn't to eliminate parts of experience, but it's to understand the movement between them. And so I have felt this week something very interesting about the idea of vibration and movement. If you look into all the stuff that's out there about communicating with interdimensional or extra-dimensional, ultra-dimensional entities, if you look at what is starting to get leaked by people who who claim to have had experience, particularly in the United States, of contact with extraterrestrial beings or interdimensional beings, or have had some experience working on alien craft like Bob Lazar. Whatever you hear, it's always usually about the ability to control or to interact with these beings and this equipment is entirely according to your vibrational state. And if your vibrational state matches, then you might be able to communicate or activate this machinery. And that's probably because these beings are so far ahead of us that they've long since been able to master this idea that you're better off controlling things using your mind. Because using your mind, you don't need to use anything physical. You don't need to be there. And you don't need to take any sort of risks with your body, because you're not going to expose it to something that could damage it. It's a wonderful idea that you're really, I suppose, projecting your consciousness, although you're physically left behind, through machinery. So it might well be that many of these experiences that people are having, many of the interactions that apparently are happening within the United States secret establishments, are all happening in the mind, and people are not physically interacting with beings and craft at all. And maybe these entities are not actually physically here. They're as good as here because we're seeing them in our minds, and we're seeing them like a dream. I also came across another book about the Rendlesham Forest incident in Suffolk, which I've discussed in a lot of detail before. And in this book, one of the witnesses to the incident described how going close to the craft that landed in the field, time seemed to slow down, and he became extremely emotional. And it was almost as if he was in a dream. And I know that hearing the evidence of, I think it was from David Grush, who talked about one of the people who worked in the UFO retrieval business for the United States government. When he was getting close to a UFO that he had to retrieve for the government, he became incredibly emotional and he started crying. And to this day, he ended up having severe emotional problems because of his close proximity to alien entities or their craft. So it does seem to be very, very closely linked. So it would seem if you wish to make contact with aliens or entities from other dimensions, you use a protocol such as we've discussed before, such as the CE5 protocol, which is a form of meditation which is designed to raise your vibrations to the level of these entities so you can actually communicate. And I believe then that is probably the same principle that is used in meditation. It's the same thing that's used in prayer. It may be even the same thing that's used with the help of psychedelic drugs. It's just allowing your consciousness to raise its vibration. My very, very first episode, way back, was all about how do I do what I do, which was channeling. Well, and I described my channeling experiences as being a bit like operating a radio with a dial, one of the old-fashioned radios, where if on the left you turn the dial, you went to sort of 88 FM, and if you turned it fully to the right, you went to 108 FM. And if you like, that represented to me us as people. That's the frequencies that we are used to receiving in our physical body. But if you hack that by forcing that dial, which I don't think you can do anymore, but in the old days you could force the dial beyond 88 to sort of down to 80 or 70s. Or I could force the dial on the right beyond 108 up to as much as 120, I think. You actually picked up other things such as aircraft and ham radio. And they're just legitimate frequencies that the radio is not really designed to pick up. But it just shows you this example of how we as humans, if we are tuned to a certain frequency, we pick up what's happening around us. That's what we're designed to do. Other animals obviously designed to pick up other frequencies and certainly can. And if you really concentrate and raise your frequency or lower your frequency from your normal operating frequencies, you can make contact with other dimensions. And that may well, of course, be the dimensions where people who have passed on and their souls, if you like, inhabit. Or it could be where other entities inhabit, such as are described as ghosts and demons and angels. It's all about your ability to set up your radio receiver in order to be able to get that reception. The fourth principle is called polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. So, at first, this does sound familiar. You have the opposites of hot and cold, or light and dark, or good and bad. But the Kybalion makes a much more subtle claim. Opposites are not fundamentally separate things. They are the same thing, expressed at different degrees. Now, when I read that, I immediately thought of last week's episode, where I read you a part from my book, Talking to the Dead, where I actually talked about the experience where I had a conversation with demons and with angels, and even a conversation with Satan, if you would believe it. And what was being made clear to me was that the idea of good and evil is pointless. It doesn't exist. Good is evil, evil is good. Demons are angels, angels are demons. They are all the same thing. They're just expressed at different degrees. Now, in the book, there is such a thing as emotional polarity, which is the difference between love and hate, or fear and courage, or sadness and joy. It means they're not separate, though. They're parts of, as if you're moving along a spectrum. It means they're all connected. You're moving along a scale. Now, the Kybalion introduces a concept called mental transmutation. This is the ability to shift your position on a spectrum. For example, moving from anger to understanding, or from fear to some steadiness, or from confusion to clarity. Not instantly, but deliberately. So if you think for a moment recently, when you felt strongly about something, ask yourself the question, what might be the opposite pole of that experience? And sort of, where am I on that spectrum? Just try to see that continuum. And then principle 5 is called rhythm. And the idea of that is that everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. Now, I love this one because it's very intuitive. And you've already experienced it. Energy comes and goes. Motivation rises and falls. Emotions move in waves. Nothing stays at a peak. Nothing stays at a low. It's like human relations. Love grows and love fades. Now, the Kybalion describes this as a kind of pendulum. It's a kind of a movement from high to low, of expansion and contraction, of activity and rest. It's not a punishment, but it's just a natural rhythm. And this can be compared to civilization. Civilizations grow and they fade. It can be taken as being a normal human experience. But the principle becomes really useful when you involve observation, because you start recognizing things as part of a cycle. What feels permanent becomes temporary. You can't stop rhythm, but you can learn to anticipate it and to work with it and avoid over-identifying with any single phase. And it creates a kind of an emotional stability. Now, if you connect the idea of polarity and rhythm together, you get polarity, which means that everything exists on a spectrum, and you get rhythm, which is you're naturally moving along that spectrum. So life becomes movement across connected opposites in cycles. And with the idea of transition, the idea is it random, or is there something very much deeper at play? Principle 6 is called cause and effect. Every cause has its effect, and every effect has its cause. And of course things have causes. It might sound obvious, but the Kybalion pushes this further. Nothing happens by chance. And I've come across that so much in the last few years. What we call chance is often just a cause that we don't yet perceive. Now, not all causes are visible. Some are immediate, like an action and a result, or delayed, like a habit, and eventually a long-term outcome, like drinking too much and getting cirrhosis of the liver over a period of years. Or internal, when you have a belief that causes you to make a decision, and then there's a consequence of that. So cause and effect isn't always linear. It's a reaction to awareness. Most of the time people live as the effects of external causes, reacting to circumstances or moods and events. But this principle suggests that there is another possibility, because not everything has to control you. You can actually just allow things to consciously influence what you want. There's responsibility without blame, because it's easy to misinterpret this as everything that happens is your fault. But that's not the point. Instead, it's about recognizing that you and I are part of a causal web, not separate from it. And awareness increases our ability to participate. So you could ask yourself, when something happens, a habit, a reaction, a pattern, what are the causes behind this? And what effects does it create over time? And then just try to trace that chain. So there you have it. And it's those 7 principles that are very important. There's mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect. And then the final 7th principle, which is called gender. Now, this is usually quite misunderstood. It's nothing really to do with modern gender studies. It's an idea of seeing that gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. That gender is everything that we know. It's not about biological sex. It's not about our identity or social roles. The Kybalion uses gender to describe something much more fundamental. There are 2 modes of energy. There is masculine energy, which is often described as active, directed and initiating. And then there's feminine energy, which is seen as receptive, generative, and nurturing. They're not opposites in conflict, but they're partners in creation. A simple analogy is to think of perhaps a seed and soil. The seed initiates and the soil receives and develops. Neither is better. Nothing grows without both. And if you bring this to your inner mind, we all have the ability to focus and decide and to act. And we have the ability to receive, imagine, and develop. These are all the principles working together. As part of creation, you need to have, if you like, the male and the female. So, if you ask yourself about creation, and if you ask yourself about the point of life, think about the idea that nothing can exist without these two sides of the gender. Now, if you want to get into modern social politics and stuff, I think it is worth examining about gay rights, gay people, and all the discussions about trans people. As far as I can make out, everything is the same. We all have male and female in us. As I understand it, all babies or embryos start life as feminine. It's only at some point in the development that masculine kicks in and separates the child that's going to be born a boy. Now, before you'll write in and tell me my science is rubbish, I'm sorry, that's just me paraphrasing, but I've read that and I do understand there's some truth to that. And again, I felt in my life, certainly, this sense that I am not entirely male. I have a lot of female in me. And yes, it's quite difficult at the moment with the discussions about the manosphere and all these influences that are trying to make men really masculine as they see it, and express what they consider to be masculine values. And those people who are critical of that will see it as being very misogynistic, anti-female, and in a way almost 18th or 19th century in their attitudes towards women and their roles. I would like to think that in the development of mankind, we are going to accept more and more that we're actually, for the sake of argument, 50% male and 50% female. And it just happens that we are born with sexual organs that define us as being, at the moment, and I don't wish to get too controversial here, as being male or female. Now, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that someone who believes that they've been born into a male body might well feel feminine. Well, that's fine. I think that's totally legitimate, as much as it is for me to say that I believe that nothing is fully 100% female and nothing is 100% male. We are all a mixture of male and female. And that then could get radically complicated if you want to say that there is nothing wrong with males being with males and females being with females. It's just a normal thing. Now, the people who criticize that say, well, it doesn't really exist in the animal kingdom. I can't really answer to that. I think it probably does. We just don't identify it as being the same as homosexuality is identified in our society. I certainly believe that we need to understand this a little bit more. And this last principle about gender seems to explain it perfectly. Now, finally, I just want to go back to what I started discussing at the beginning, which was the books about alien abduction. But it ties up some of the stuff that I've learned with the Kybalion. One of the quieter but kind of unsettling overlaps between the Kybalion and the book Initiated: An Incident at Devil's Den is the role of numbers and coincidence, or at least what we call coincidence. In Initiated, Matthew Roberts describes repeated encounters with meaningful numbers, sequences that appear at specific moments, and they're often tied to emotional intensity or key events. But these aren't just random timestamps. They begin to feel as if they are placed, as if something is using a pattern, especially numerical pattern, as a form of communicational signaling. And Terry Lovelace's account is slightly different in tone, but similar in effect. In his Incident at Devil's Den, the strange timing of events, the recurrence of specific dates, and the alignment of experiences across years all seem to carry a kind of structured improbability. It's not always obvious at first, but when viewed as a whole, there is a sense that the randomness doesn't quite hold up. Now, a very long-time listener and friend of the podcast, Esther, in Spain, has many times written to me about numbers and the coincidences in her life concerning numbers. And I think it's very important, therefore, to see that the Kybalion offers a framework that's surprisingly relevant. Because one of its core principles, cause and effect, makes that direct claim that nothing happens by chance. What we call coincidence is simply a cause we don't yet perceive. It doesn't mean patterns are always intentional, but it does open a different possibility that some patterns, especially repeated ones, may reflect an underlying structure. Numbers are one of the simplest ways for patterns to show up. They're abstract, they're universal, they're precise. And if maybe it's something we're interacting across different levels of perception, as Robertson Lovelace suggests in different ways, then numbers would be an efficient medium. And certainly Esther has told me in her writing that these numbers appear at particular times of her life. They appear when she's feeling particular emotions or memories. And they definitely seem to be a form of communication that she believes might be coming from her passed on husband. I can certainly say, in my experience, that this is true. I think numbers are a universal language and are probably a means of communication that is being used across consciousness. They stand out to us because we look at them and think, that's a coincidence. But it gets you connected some way to something that you can't normally experience. They are very meaningful. Now, the Kybalion adds another layer to this. If reality is mental in nature, then perception itself becomes part of the equation. So when someone notices recurring numbers, the question isn't just, is this external or internal? Because from a Hermetic perspective, that line isn't so clear. And instead, you have to ask, is that pattern emerging through me or around me, or both? And what's fascinating across all these three sources is not just that numbers appear, it's that they appear at moments that feel significant, during the encounters with aliens, or during realizations, or during shifts in awareness. It means that the meaning isn't the number itself, but the timing of its appearance. So it's a more precise way of looking at things, that some coincidences are just coincidence, but some patterns are projections. And some may point to a structure we don't fully yet understand. So next time that you notice a pattern, especially one that repeats or aligns and feels intentional, you don't have to assume it's a message from another conscious realm, but you also shouldn't dismiss it just as background noise, because somewhere between that randomness and meaning is a pattern. And that pattern is where your understanding begins. And it's going to be interesting to follow that pattern to see where it leads. So I hope you found this episode interesting. I hope you can also see what I see, how all these mental things, everything that's come through, such as the Kybalion, everything that's really occurring with the breakthroughs and an understanding of what interdimensional contact might be all about, the understanding that people who have passed on from human physical form and have, as we call it, died, and are existing in a consciousness state, are able to communicate with us and, of course, never go. And they're always there with us. And are, if you like, trying to contact us through patterns and through numbers. And if you're lucky enough, can actually contact you through channeling or through dreams. As to the nature of these souls now, we've discussed that in previous episodes, but it's just wonderful to me, and it makes me so happy that at last science is beginning to understand this. We're going to hopefully come up in the next few weeks with more disclosure from governments that are going to, at last, I think, be honest with the world's people that we're not alone and have never been alone, and that the consciousness that they have made contact with is different from ours, and in fact is probably far more like what happens to you when you die. I think it's going to be such a wonderful time for humanity. Yes, there is perhaps a slightly scary side, because I think it's Representative Burleson, who's one of the members of the House of Representatives, who's actually kind of scaring people by saying that, he's seen stuff that we're about to be allowed to see that keeps him up at night, or that the stuff that we are going to learn in the next few weeks or months could unglue the society and the civilization as we know it. Well, that sounds a bit scary, and it sounds like, well, maybe we don't want to know it. I hope it's not going to be like that. I hope it will have a fundamental shift in people's understanding of our place in the universe and bring it all together. This unified theory that people have been looking for in physics. And I think hopefully it'll make us a lot happier. As to whether it's going to also lead us to areas of research such as unlimited energy or travel, I don't know. But certainly at the consciousness level, I think it's going to be remarkable. Thank you.